Hello and welcome to this new series that we're going to be doing on A Bit Lit, where we'll be looking at objects, items, things, artefacts as the jumping off point for thinking about a particular cultural moment. And this will come under this broad banner, Thingterests. And these are going to be very short videos, sort of between 5 and 10 minutes, in which we just concentrate and leap off from that particular item under question. And like Emma's Stay-at-Home Shakespeare series, we're hoping that these videos might be of some use to people who are studying at university and schools and want to kind of engage with a range of different kind of literary, historical, cultural questions, but also to just be of broader research interests. And so on that question, I'd quite like to start off the series by thinking about these. So these are fruit seeds and nuts that were discovered at the Rose Playhouse in the 1980s when it was excavated. So the Rose Playhouse is a 16th century theatre that was built sort of in the middle of a spate of a playhouse building in the 1580s. And its discovery in the 1980s was of particular significance to theatre history for our understanding of what it would have been like to go and see a play in that time, because it was the first space that emerged that had modern archaeological excavations done to it, and so its architecture and the artefacts that came out of the playhouse are now really kind of foundational in our understanding of practical playgoing and how you built a theatre, what they looked like, what people did in them. So that's one reason we might pause and think about things like these apple seeds. And I'm particularly interested in apple seeds. Here we have a kind of array of detritus from the period. And that in itself, I think, is fascinating. We have what is essentially throwaway food that now exists and can be photographed, and we can talk about it now, despite it being 400 years old. So this kind of casual idea of just throwing something away, I like that it resurfaces, it recycles, and it becomes part of our starting point, at least in this case, for thinking about history and culture in Elizabethan England. And in that sense, they sort of become similar to popcorn in a cinema, because what I'm doing in this very moment is asking, well, what if we start with the popcorn? What's it like to go to a cinema? Instead of concentrating on the film that is on, instead of looking at Scorsese, looking at Tarantino, what if you start by thinking of the journey of the popcorn and what that represents? And this kind of brings us into the audience, the people sat there, the people watching, the people doing things in the auditorium. So I'm not particularly interested, at least in this moment, in thinking about the symbolic uses of an apple. So when Shakespeare invokes an apple to indicate kind of sexual appetite, or to reference the fool and Adam and Eve and its kind of biblical connotations, I'm interested in its actual practical uses as props and as things to eat. So I'm just going to cover reasonably quickly 4 kind of areas that I think are interesting and exciting to think about the historic apple. So the first one is apples for sale. Apples were available across the social spectrum in early modern England, and that means that anybody, even an apprentice, could probably afford to buy and eat an apple when they're at the playhouse. And we know that that's something that people did because we have eyewitness accounts. And I like that this kind of corroborates this material evidence that we have, these seeds and these nuts. We also have somebody witnessing that and kind of putting flesh to the bones, to some sense putting the flesh back on the apple core. Because one of the key sources for theatrical evidence of this period is people who travel over from Europe, move around England, and then write down what they've seen on their kind of tour. And one such person, Hentzner, comes over from Europe and he visits the theatres and the bear baiting arenas, places where animals were sort of baited for sport and for pleasure. And he describes what he saw going on in them. And he talks about fruits such as apples and pears being sold according to the season, and also nuts and ale and wine being sold around these venues. So here we have a very clear sense that you could go in and you could buy what it is you wanted to eat whilst you're watching the entertainment that's on offer. The second aspect that I think is interesting is the association of apples with play. So not only the fact that people went there and ate them, like we would eat snacks, but actually that the apple in itself represents a kind of form of play and sometimes actually became part of the play. So we can start with thinking about Shakespeare's gloss on this. So in Henry VIII, one of the later plays that Shakespeare wrote, he talks about the youths that thunder at a playhouse and fight for bitten apples. And he's referring to, in this particular scene, the porter has shut the doors of the palace and this whole rowdy crowd are outside trying to get in. And he talks about them being the youths that thunder at a playhouse and fight for bitten apples. So I love this idea that Shakespeare, in this kind of throwaway line really, brings together young playgoers, people going to watch plays, and the apples that were literally consumed in them. These are bitten apples. And what the porter means by this remark is that they're very quick to quarrel. You know, they would even fight over an apple core. But I think it kind of speaks to something more broadly true about the theatre of the period, which is that fruits and playgoers were quite closely connected, fruits and playhouses also. So we can go back some 20 years before something like Henry VIII was written and think about a play like George Peele's The Arraignment of Paris. This entire play is set up by an apple. And right at the very beginning of the play, somebody brings on what they describe as a golden ball. And they place it more or less in the centre of the stage. And they say to the three women who are the protagonists in the play, Venus and Pallas and Juno, they are to compete for who is most beautiful. And the person who is victorious in that competition will win this golden ball. Which goes on to be clarified that this is an apple. So we have an apple kickstarting a kind of narrative oomph for this whole play and being the central prop over which these three powerful women, some of the most sort of powerful and repeat characters of the 1580s stages, they come on and they fight for an apple. So here we have youths, because these three goddesses would have been played by young boys, quite literally thundering in a playhouse and fighting for an apple in the way that kind of Shakespeare indicates in a very different context. So we have apples here for playgoers, and we have them on stage as a kind of fundamental part of dramatic play. But there are also other aspects of play in which apples occur. And to some extent, these are perhaps more surprising and more interesting. So I really like the example of Richard Tarleton. So Tarleton is probably one of the most famous performers of the entire Elizabethan period. And he's a comic, a kind of a stand-up comic. He's also an actor, and he's also a fencer. And he's in a very prestigious troupe, the Queen's Men, from about the 1580s onwards. And he's known for his set pieces within plays. He'll come on and do a little sort of routine. But he was also very good at making stuff up on the spot. And he was so famous that in the years after his death, people continued to publish stories about how riotously funny he was when he was on stage. And one of these collections contains an anecdote that describes him stood on a stage at the Bull in Bishopsgate Street, and in the middle of a performance with the Queen's Men, somebody throws a pippin at him. And a pippin is a type of apple, or another word for a kind of apple. And this anecdote describes how Tarleton picks up the apple and then he riffs on it. He has a kind of set piece just off the moment, bang. And the set piece basically is just him saying that he's going to break the nose of the person who threw the apple at him. You know, the idea is that this apple becomes this license, this kind of prompt for performance, and it crosses in this moment from the audience, the person who might buy the apple, according to our European visitor, to the stage where it becomes an object of performance. Now, on top of all of that, there's an even more wild account of play that a man called Luitpold von Wedel describes when he visits from the continent. He goes into a bear baiting arena and he describes how all this chaos is going on. There are fireworks going off. There's a huge rose set over the top of the space in which spectators are stood. And out of this rose comes falling lots of apples, and people are scrambling around trying to pick these apples up. Luitpold von Wedel describes this as a play. So we have this weird sort of sense in which apples can be a reasonably traditional dramatic prop, we open a performance with it, people deliver their lines, it's kind of a centerpiece for the stage. But apples are also this kind of more immersive experience that might be distributed amongst a crowd who are then really a part of the performance themselves, a performance that is entirely built up of spectacle. So, I think it's really fascinating that these tiny little pips actually had a hugely dynamic theatrical life, and not just in playhouses, but across different types of entertainment venues in the 16th century. The third aspect that I think why I think apples are quite interesting in regards to entertainment and playgoing is their seasonality, because they kind of mirror playhouses in that respect. Apples are in season from mid-September for the most part, several months. And seasons of plays in this period also work very loosely on seasons too. And part of the reason for that is that in the winter time, there's a sort of Christmas hiatus, a number of troupes perform at court. But there were also repeated accounts of travel being disrupted, of the weather being terrible, of sort of interrupting journeys to play because of the foul season. The flip side of that is in the summer, when people like the London authorities, the mayor, the Common Council, will often restrict playing because it is so hot a season, is the kind of language that they use. And the heat of high summer is often considered to be conducive to plague. It might spread the plague. So you get these kind of two bookend moments of pausing in the season. So I like the idea that these seeds that were discovered in the rose, they to some extent represent a kind of new autumn-winter season that brings theatre and performance out of a summer that may well have been, quite dangerous, and where there would have been limited playing in London. And as such, that means that when we have physical references to them, when somebody lobs an apple at a comic performer, or when Peele's The Arraignment of Paris brings on an apple or brings fruit onto the stage, we can think about it in temporal terms as well as in theatrical or fictional terms. We can associate this with the months following September, and think about these plays as really attuned to their kind of agricultural and food environments, and therefore for their wider kind of environmental contexts. The last reason why I think apple seeds like these and the various kind of nuts and bolts, you might say, of the playhouse are interesting is because of their relationship with the fabric and the structure of something like the Rose Playhouse, of a theatre. So later on in the sort of the 1650s, a man called Edmund Gayton reflects back on his memories of what it was like to go and see a play some 30, 40 years earlier, in the early 17th century. And he describes how people would often on festival days, so these are particularly raucous holidays, they would go to the playhouse and they would ask for a particular play, a particular favourite, like making a request to a DJ for a song. And so the performing troupes would sometimes give you a little bit of this play, a little bit of Tamburlaine. They'd sometimes give you a little bit of this play, The Merry Milkmaids. And sometimes they'd do patches of both. And when none of those would placate the audience, who were very merry, the playhouses were being kind of destroyed. There was such kind of activity in them. And Edmund Gayton is really painting this up. He's sort of over-egging it. But the way he describes it is really fascinating, because he talks about how the benches, the tiles, the laths, the stones, oranges, apples, nuts flew about most liberally. And what I like about this is that it ties in this food stuff, these fruits, with the real material stuff of the theatre. It's benches, it's wood, the place where people are sat, the things that keep the roof on. And so this kind of brings us round to finding these seeds in the yard of a place like the Rose, because they've become part of the fabric and the architecture of that building. And therefore they kind of help us to think, or they provide a starting point for that kind of question of what was it like to build a playhouse, and what was it like to go in and watch a play in one.